I'm really thrilled to be here. I got here last night and I spent the day kind of tooling around looking at things. So I'm really having a great time. So my office, as I said, is about half residential work and half other projects, which you just heard about. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about both, but really what I want to talk about is underlying design principles that guide our practice, because I think in landscape architecture, I think for years it really wasn't recognized because really good work was invisible. And how do you photograph invisible? So really the medium of what we're working in is space. And unlike architecture where you're designing objects and you might spend time, like tonight you're spending time in the theater, or you might spend time in your living room. In landscapes, we spend a lot of time moving through them, and I think how you move through them and how we choreograph that movement is a very important design aspect that I think truly belongs in the landscape architectural realm, and it's an area that I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think it's something I'd like to share. So, Rowanji in Japan, Japanese gardens, I spoke once at a conference in Australia, and there was a Japanese landscape architect there, and he spoke very poor English, but he said to me after I showed this and talked, he said, it's not about the rocks, it's about the space between. And so this tonight will be about the space between. I'm as much influenced by modernist and minimalist artists as I am by architects and landscape architects. And I think this is a work of Fred Sandback, and he used this colored string in a gallery to suggest space. And so, if you're in this gallery, you don't feel like you can walk through that plane. It feels like a solid thing. And so the idea, to me, it's very similar to what we do in landscape architecture, because in landscape architecture, we have very minimal materials to work with given the scale of the environment that we're dealing with, so that we are suggesting space as much as we are carving or building it. So that's really something that has been a big inspiration to me. Probably the most powerful art moment I've ever had, and maybe the most powerful moment I've had in nature, was when I went out to the lightning fields in New Mexico. And the way they orchestrate, you book it through the Dia Foundation, and you make it months in advance. And so I carefully planned it to go in August when they have the most lightning. And so it's a kilometer by a mile of these 22-foot high poles spaced equally across this grid. And they bring you there in the middle of the day with some prepackaged food, and they're just thrown in there. It's kind of a social experiment, too, because you're in this little cabin with a bunch of strangers. I think there are 4 bedrooms. And so I went with a friend, and, you get there, and because the sun is high, the poles disappear in the landscape. So you are meant to spend time there, which is what we do in the landscape. We see it in different times of year, different times of day. That whole passage of time is inherent and embedded in that. So you spend the time there, and what I found out was that actually this almost never happens. You have to be win the lottery to see lightnings at the poles. But really it's not about that at all. It's about constructing space or suggesting space within this vast plain in the high desert that brings a human scale to that you're measuring yourself against in this vast landscape. So the following morning we were there. We got up before dawn and we stood there, and as it was kind of, you didn't see the poles at all, and you saw this dark silhouette of the mountains. And then as the sun came over the ridge, and it was like bing, and the light hit these silver poles, and all of a sudden it was like electric current hit the back of my neck. And it was so powerful, this juxtaposition of these little thin man-made objects against this beautiful landscape. Another artist that's influenced me a lot is Donald Judd, and this is at Marfa, Texas. But the idea in the 60s that he really developed, along with some other artists, was the idea that a sculpture doesn't sit on a pedestal in a place. The sculpture becomes a part of the environment. So where does the gallery end? Where does the landscape beyond begin? It's all blurred together. And to me, this was really exciting to think about landscape as art, and that blurring together of art, architecture, and landscape. Another big influence is Robert Irwin. This is at the Dia Foundation, and he actually replaced some of the windows there so that the kind of obscured windows frame the openings, and so he has selected the views he wants you to see, and that's what we do with trees and vegetation in the landscape. We focus views that we want people to look at. And this is a piece of Robert Irwin's that was commissioned by one of my clients a couple of years ago up in the wine country that kind of illustrates that in a really nice way. When I talk about our work, I worked in my early years for architecture firms, and so I have a pretty formalistic view to things. But what I like to say is that it's as if you drew a line. The designs always have a strong underlying architecture, but it's as if you erase that line or partly erase that line. So the structure is visible, but the structure is permeable and in some cases mutable, which I'll get into. This is Michael Heitzer's double negative, where the idea that he's carved into this raw landscape, we make space by carving as well as building. So he's carved into that space, and what you're doing is you're suggesting a connection across, and he says it's like you looking back at yourself. And so as you stand there, you're aware of that other thing, but your mind mentally connects those. So these are lessons and tools that I take and I like to think about as I make work. And finally, the idea of passage. Passage is really important, as I mentioned, in landscape. And when Richard Serra talks about this piece by Robert Smithson in the Great Salt Lake, the spiral jetty, in our minds, we always think of it as like the image on the left, which is a purely graphical image. But actually, if you look at the image on the right, and you see the little tiny people walking in it, it was meant to be walked. It wasn't meant to be seen from an airplane. So again, it's about moving ever closer to the center and how that allows you to interact with your environment. That becomes very powerful. For the last 20 years, I've been working, or actually probably 25 years, I've been working on a ranch called Oliver Ranch, north of San Francisco in Sonoma County. It's developed by a guy and owned by a guy named Steve Oliver, who is a contractor, but he loves art, and he has created a site-specific art installation on his ranch, and he has people like Richard Serra, Martin Purrier, and this is a staircase by Bruce Nauman on the property. It's a quarter-mile long, and what's interesting about it is it follows the topography of the land. So the tread width is always the same, but the riser height varies. So as you're walking on this, and this is a picture of my office going there a number of years ago, as you walk it, you're actually you have to be careful as you're walking. I mean, clearly that's why they have codes that the rides are always the same. But as you're walking this, where the height varies, you suddenly stop. And when you stop, you look out at this beautiful valley. So he's choreographed the movement and it allows you to engage with nature in a way that is just so subtle and powerful at the same time. So we did a little. We were asked to do a little intervention there. As I said, we've done work there, kind of quiet landscape work because you've got all this art. You don't want to be competing. So there's the area at the top is a. Oops, wrong way. This is. I can't see it. Anyway, I'll show you here. This are two walls that are carved into this hill. This is a studio, and this is a studio and a courtyard in between. And the main house is to the south on the page. And I was asked to create a stairway to go up to there's a little stairs you can barely see, and you come down. And it really bothered me that this very strong, powerful move of these walls incised in the earth, that you would be entering it perpendicular to the main movement of the architecture. These are the walls. And so I wanted to do was create something that actually was parallel to that and permeable and disappeared into the landscape. So this is the walls kind of appear as the hill rises to the right. And so these are the steps, and the steps are made out of corten, and they're just subtly carved into the land, and the gravel is the same color as our native hillside grasses in the summer. And so when you look at it sideways, it actually completely disappears. So this is the main walkway. And so for the same client, he's an interesting guy. He's a project person. I have a lot of clients who are repeat clients or project people, and so he bought this old prune packing plant. The railroad used to run in this direction along here, and where the vineyards are now, they would dry prune plums out in the fields, and then they would pack them and take them back east because in the days before refrigeration. So he bought it. We work with Mark Jensen, an architecture firm in San Francisco, to create this new place for artist studios and artists in residency and an office for Steve and his son. And so it was kind of a mixed use kind of thing, and also a place for them to have events and fundraisers for different arts organizations. One of the things that we were asked to do is raise the grade 4 feet above the valley. And sometimes I think planners are crazy and they make you do things that are absolutely ridiculous. And I thought, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. This valley is like a mile wide. When we got done, there was a flood. It washed out the bridge, and the water level went right up to the door. So I'm a believer now. I think they know more than I give them credit for. So the idea was that these plants, this is a totally artificial landscape that we've made, and I wanted to create different outdoor rooms in each one of them. So you can see we're kind of, so we graded up 4 feet, and you can see we're raised up, and the building is permeable with the landscape. And so this is the plan. So, oops, sorry, go back. So as you drive here, you get a view through here, through this grove of trees, and then and through here, there's another view from another doorway. So these rooms are actually engaging the landscape. So what I did is I set a datum. I wanted it to be beautiful and architectural and tight at the top, and then dissolve or evolve, dissolve into the landscape beyond. So this is, and then we brought these big olive trees in to give some scale in this vast landscape. What was really interesting to me, and you always learn something. Sometimes you don't know about it when you have to do something. But what I realized is, when you're in a vineyard, the grapes are about 6 feet tall. And when you're up 4 feet, suddenly you're higher than the grapes. So instead of being like in the grapes, you're part of the big valley. So that to me was like just a huge revelation that this subtle grade change could totally transform your experience. And, totally by accident. So anyway, so you're up there, and then we use the same stone as the local Napa cobble chip stone, and again, beautifully crafted at the top, and then we just pushed and tumbled the stone next to it. And I wanted to create, sometimes I think, again, maybe this is from the influence of art, I want to create strong emotional connections in the landscape. Sometimes they're not comfortable. Sometimes there's a little bit of discomfort. And the idea here was to create this tension with this rural landscape, which is dirty and messy and dusty, with this kind of pristine art landscape above. And then carving, using bocce ball to kind of carve in as an excuse to make another smaller space within this landscape. Again, suggesting an outdoor room in this vast landscape. And then looking out over the vines and then opening up so you can actually walk into the landscape and be part of it. And you could have a dance performance here. They've had dance performances here as part of their fundraisers. And then the idea, too, of carving to create another room to the right, which I'll show another picture of, and that, again, that tension between that full to the brim reflecting pool that actually is coplanar with the interior. And as you look from the outside, it forms a seamless plane between inside and outside, again, dissolving that boundary, and then carving in to create this space below where other events could happen. And so this is looking back. Again, what I love about it is very different from this angle is the 2 Corten steps totally disappear, and what you get is this outdoor room, and we used Korean sun pear, and I wanted something that was a memory. I think strong memories to the landscape are also really important, that this would be a memory of the landscape that was there when there were prune plums growing there and you had flowers in the spring, fall color. And so, but it also, kind of influence of Dan Kiley creates this room out there that, and this can be hot out there, that creates a place where they could have shade. And then that center area where there's the art gallery to the right, you look out between the trees at dawn, and where does one begin and where does the other end? And then this is looking out from one of the other doorways where we actually cut in and made a lower terrace so with about a foot lower. So this Corten ramp connects you to the door and then goes down. And this is under the trees, these mulberry trees. They have big dinners and they bring tables out there. But you can see again that that connects out into the vineyard. The vineyard actually aligns with that. And you know, in a landscape where there's not a lot of detail, every detail counts. So, you know, how that Corten ramp was put together was really important. And then also at night, it's very dramatic. So this very quiet landscape at night has a whole different feeling. And I love the idea that we can use light to create landscapes that are very different at different times of the day. This is another property we worked on for a long time. The client initially had a little Ranchburger house. It's near the town of Sonoma. And then as time went on, he would buy adjoining properties. And now he has a 16-acre, they have a 16-acre estate. They make wine, it's all organic. They make wine, they make olive oil, and they have an organic farm that they sell to restaurants. So they bought this adjoining property, which had been a commune, and it was pretty ramshackle, and they took down all the buildings. So this is after the buildings came down, and these amazing trees were there. These trees, some of them are over 500 years old, and so it really became this landscape, this very flat landscape with these large trees. And how do you make space? It's 3.5 acres. How do you give some kind of how do you against that scale? How do you make this make sense? And this is after we were done. We ended up planting a lot of it in a drought-tolerant meadow, but the trees become really an important focal point. So this is during construction, and the building to the left we call the Zen Spa. They're little to the top left corner is their house, which is just this like cute little Ranchburger house that they fixed up. It's not that fancy, so they wanted a place that they could bring people to and have parties and events. And then the other structure is an observatory, and he actually has a telescope there that he lets universities use, and then it actually beams back to a screen in the Zen Spa. So trying to give some kind of structure on this really big site was really important. Another important factor was that there was a creek next to it called Carriger Creek, and the willows in the creek all had sort of a blue color, but you know, in the wintertime, this really ugly house on the lower right corner was visible. So screening that became another important part of the design. So that kind of gives you the overview. So this is the Zen Spa when it was finished. This was done by Studios Architecture. I think what you can see is we moved these 100-year-old olive trees in. I'll show some more pictures of that. They formed the screen on the edge, and you can see again that the color of the olive dissolves into the landscape of the willows, so that again that boundary is blurred and made much more diaphanous with the plantings. And you know, protecting the trees was really important, so we actually went out and staked it before we finished the construction documents and kind of tweaked where it would be. You can see that that main entrance is pointing out towards between the two trees. And then this is the main entrance, and this is looking back the other way. Our live oaks don't like to have summer water. We don't get rain from April to October, so the landscape is very spare with just mulch, but we use acanthus, so I have a really strong architectural plant right up against the building, and then there's these stepping stones across the landscape. So close up, and then we planted. We placed the house at the high point around the site, but the same year that the other property flooded, this property flooded, and they had about $1.5 million of damage. About 18 inches of water go over the whole property. So having a swale around it was important to, like a dry creek bed, to divert the water around. So because we don't get water for 6 months a year, it would be inappropriate to put water plants. So these are all succulents and irises and spring bulbs that require almost no irrigation to do well. And so again, they have the structure and the strength to hold up against these really ancient trees. So going back to the plan, again, this is really about how you kind of move around the property. We've constructed the Alley of Olives so that you can walk through the building, you can walk around. There's a, they actually drive their little carts to get around the site. And you can see there's two buildings, and the whole time, the little triangle on the right, forget that. The whole time, that was all the project was. And the wonderful thing about working on residential projects is there's always room for making things better. And I always felt like the high point is on the left and it slopes to the right. And the entire time I worked on the project, I felt like it was unfinished, and I didn't really know how to deal with it, but I had this sort of gut feeling that something was wrong. Right across the road there was a llama farm, not very attractive. And it's called Stonehenge Farm, the property, and it's 100-foot, I think 300-foot deep alluvial plain. And every time you put a shovel in the ground, you come up with rock. So by the end of construction, we had this giant pile of rocks. And it sat there for a long time. This is a lap pool. And I kept thinking, and then I thought, oh, it's going to go away. They're going to haul it all away. What am I going to be looking at? I'm going to be looking at the llama farm. So one day I said to the client, you just sort of like, I don't know what possessed me. I just said, we should use those rocks and do something with them. And he said, yeah, that makes sense. And I said, well, how about we build a giant stone pyramid? And he said, okay. And I, whoa, that was the easiest sell ever. But like a week later, he called me back and he said, no way, we can't do that. That's crazy. But he's the only person I know who employs a full-time stonemason because it looks like the Appian Way in parts of it because, he's got so much rock. So anyway, he had Pedro and the guys build this. So what was really interesting, again, one of those things you learn by doing, because who thinks about this? It's on an angle. It's a sundial. It's not a wall. It's not flat. It's a sundial. And it's 15 feet high and 100 feet long. And it actually makes those trees even more beautiful than they are because you're watching the passage of time across the face of that pyramid. So to me, that was not planned, but it becomes like a hugely important part of the design that the passage of time is being honored and marked. And it also, of course, the apex of the pyramid is centered on the lap pool. And you can see the observatory to the right. And the observatory is set within a reflecting pool, which is supposed to be good for the optics, but really it's about the sense of going across water to enter that kind of inner sanctum. There's, again, an emotional thing about crossing water. Bridges are really powerful. So the idea of moving across to that is really an important part of the design. And then the plant that we planted is called Condopetalum, which is a restio, which is like a sedge. So it has little capsules on the end that are the same color as the Corten stele. So the landscape and the architecture are kind of tied together metaphorically. And then the other thing I love about meadows, this meadow is made with primarily two grasses. One is I'm not a strict nativist. I picked these grasses because they're drought tolerant and they have a very narrow leaf, and the two grasses look the same, so they're kind of flowering, as grasses, the seed heads flower at different times of the summer. So, and what's really interesting about a grass, it's Pennisetum spathulatum and Festuca marii. So one is native to South Africa and one is native to the Atlas Mountains in Turkey. So the idea that it actually has a mass, I mean, you live in a prairie area, the prairie has, that meadow has a mass, but that mass is changing, sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high, and your sense of enclosure is, again, a fluid thing. But, you're in that space and you're contained within that larger landscape by the grasses. And then the trees, we moved in these 43 olives from an old orchard in Northern California, and they all took. And they were the first things we put in because we had access issues. And the other thing is, I just think in a site like this, subtlety of color. So you have the meadow that I just talked about, and then in the front we have the little blue stem. The little blue stem at the end of the summer is kind of pinky, and so then you have this like gold color. You have the pink, which actually is on the tree on the left is a California pepper, and it has pink berries. So there's this reference between, a very subtle reference between the berry color and the grass color, and then the silver dissolving into the willows. You know, on resident, when we started doing more institutional projects, I struggled a little bit with the story. I think a garden is a personal expression, and a landscape is more of a cultural expression. And when you move from one to the other, when you're not sort of mining your client's deep personal history to kind of come up with reasons why a garden should be the way it is, and you're faced with a kind of blank canvas of, well, what is it? We started to look for the idea of memory and narrative to kind of construct this landscape. And this is 2 science buildings on the UCSF campus. One to the left is a cardiovascular research building, and the one to the right is a cancer center. And the idea was to create, one of the important briefs that we got from the director was that we wanted to create a landscape that would encourage social interaction. So scientists from one group and another group would meet each other. And this also was embedded in the building too, that there was a stair connecting all the floors, and those stairs had lounges across them. So everything was about making social connections even more powerful. And so that was one thing that we looked at, and also movement across campus. And the other thing was, this was all on fill. This is the old railroad site that was later bought by the university. So the fill then became what had been a beautiful salt marsh was now all filled land. And we thought, well, how can we recreate that memory of the salt marsh? And one of the things we have in San Francisco is in the summertime, the wind, the valleys gets very hot. We have very extreme temperature variations between the coast and inland. So it sucks the fog in. So at about 2 in the afternoon to about 4 in the afternoon, it's just howling wind. So the idea that you could actually use the wind to make a landscape that actually is in motion was important. And the other thing was a plan that actually was like the echocardiogram, so that actually it was kind of frenetic like that, but also calm. So, so this is the main walkway to the front door lined with the ginkgos. And then as you walk through it, the landscape, the other thing is this entire area underneath this is a 4-foot deep cistern that collects all the rainwater. So we couldn't put trees in there, and actually in San Francisco you want sun because it's cold in the summer. So there's only one tree in that whole space besides the ginkgos. So this is but what happens is that the people move around. They have communal tables. We work with landscape forums on this to customize some of their pieces, and we created these long tables. And then to the lower part, instead of using lawn, I think we look at these as opportunities to create new paradigms for planting. These are all native grasses that sod company in California is making these native grasses into sods. So we have this idea of this like layering of this kind of moundy grasses with the pennisetum to the right, and then just sort of layering the grasses. So it's a formal planting. There are lines of grasses. This is not messy. These are formal, but again, there's a layering, and the movement is really a strong part of what it is. And different time of day, season. No, and the calamagrostis. And then at night, there's these little fairy lights that kind of direct you. In the front of the building is a very civic gesture. It's the northern entrance to the campus. So we moved in these palm trees and the Washingtonias. And so that's on the north side of the campus. It's more of a public plaza. And then across the street, we landscape we considered the whole front entry as a piece of a kind of a bookends. And then behind this is actually a temporary power plant. So what we did is we designed a fence that would be kind of the temporary architecture. And it's a corrugated, perforated metal that you can, light comes through. And, it's a playful thing. And then behind it is giant timber bamboo that hides all the equipment. So this is the layering. movement was really important in another science building that we did over at UC Berkeley. And from the street on the lower part to the front door is 11-foot grade change. And we had to get ADA access up there. So we decided to make the ADA access and the movement through the site into a part of the design, a strong part of the design, so that it was, you know, a movement. So here is that, the front stairway, and then next to it is the sculptural Corten steel weaving through, again with the native grasses. And then somebody doing what we hope they don't do. But, and then, you know, one thing, in public buildings, and I think in university buildings in particular, you don't know what's going on inside. Is it an English building, a science building? Unless you see the sign, how do you know? So the idea here became how we give like subtle clues to what's happening inside the building, and it's a bioenergy research facility. So we thought about how we could make that visible in the landscape. And these are the molecules for the ethanol, the biodiesel, methanol that they make from grasses. So we took this idea of grasses and overlaid that with the molecules and created this abstracted pattern of holes in the Corten steel. And so then as you see it, it kind of gives you like, oh, what's that? I'd like to know more. And then as you go up, and then at night, it actually lights the path and becomes a constellation of dots. I think sometimes we do our best work when our clients really trust us to do things. I think this is an example of that. This is a residence in Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. And the client bought this house, and then he got stuck in the planning with a local neighborhood group that said, you can't touch that house, you can't do anything, you have to be wood. They told him all these things, and he was very discouraged. He used to be a head of a video game company, so a wildly creative guy, and he really wanted to do a lot, and they wouldn't let him do anything. So when we started working at the landscape, one of the things that the architect wanted to do was lower the building. The garage is underneath to the left, and he wanted to lower it 6 feet so that, because before you kind of went up here and there was a little tiny flat spot and you went in the garage, so it was very dangerous to go in and out. So we lowered it 6 feet, but that meant instead of like a 12-foot grade change or a 13-foot grade change, we had almost 20-foot grade change between the driveway where they park or the guest park up to the front door of the house. And that's a daunting schlep, to go up 20 feet to your front door. So we wanted to make that journey a really choreographed and really interesting, and to have that be about embracing the landscape. So there's a cliff there. It drops down, I don't know, a couple hundred feet. And so you come to the property at the front gate here. We had to put brick. I've never used brick in my life. And then there's actually a turning table that turns you so that when you leave, you have room to back up. And so you walk in this gate, you walk up here. This protects the cars from hitting you. God forbid they slip. And then you walk up the stairs, and then you have these opportunities to actually engage with the landscape and be over the cliff. I thought it would be really interesting to do something that was scary and that would actually make some people a little afraid, or other people would be thrilled, but that actually there's a strong visceral reaction to walking to the front door. It wasn't just a normal thing. So here you come in, and you're like, these eucalyptus trees are here, and it's cantilevered over a little bit, so you can almost touch them, and then you have the tactile quality of the board form concrete next to you that you're kind of brushed against, subtly lit, and you keep going, and then the first thing, then you see these overlooks kind of cascading, cantilevered over the cliff. And then when you get to the top, you come to the flat spot, and you see these, it becomes, you're looking at it more like a series of stacked planes. And then when you go out, it's backlit, it's facing south. You don't see the glass. The glass totally disappears. And there are people who will not walk out there. They just will not do it. And then you're looking at the whole skyline of downtown. So, you want to walk out there. It's drawing you out there. And And then the other thing we did, which is kind of mean, we put grading underneath so that when you walk, you actually can see straight down and see how far up you are. So they loved it, and it's been really interesting to watch people's reactions to that. But, I would not have done, I don't think I would have suggested that if I hadn't done 3 or 4 projects for this client before, but he totally trusted us, which was great. This is the Wendover Contemplative Center down at Stanford, and this building has two functions. One is to be an art gallery showing the work of a former professor called Nathan Oliveira, who's an important Bay Area artist, but not particularly nationally known. And there was a donor that was willing to give money to him, but Stanford didn't want to just give money for a building because they thought anybody who had a donor would have a building, and they have like little buildings everywhere over campus. So in order to control that, it had to have a function that was more important for the campus. And one of those was, Stanford, they call them the ducks because, like they're swimming like this across the water, but underneath they're doing this because, it's like the Ivy League schools in the Northeast are very, it's cold. People are, sitting in cafes. Out here, you're like biking, in your shorts. It just feels like everybody's happy but you. And so having a meditation center was something, they have a suicide rate. So having a meditation center, a place where the kids could go and reduce the stress was really, really important. So we worked with the Dean of Religious Life and the donor and the university to create the space. So the idea is, again, this is all about passage, and because it's meditation, there's a gate, a fence here. Then you walk through these trees. You walk to the front door, and if your dorm's over here, you might continue, and just this becomes like a little shortcut out this way. Then when you get to the front door, you walk in, and then the first painting's here. Then you turn and you see the water. And what's interesting about it, because there's about a 4-foot grade change from the street to the back. And the building, we worked very closely with the architects from the beginning. This is designed by Adlin Darling. And at the front end, it's actually perched above the ground. And this courtyard, it becomes raised up around it, defining that space. And then when you get into the backside, it's actually cut into the ground. But as you're walking up, you're really not aware of that. And then there's this beautiful oak grove here, and then finally a meditation walk that we designed. So this is this is a bike path to the right. So it's kind of the active part of campus, planted with bamboo, and then you see the sign. And again, the sign has slots in it, the wall. So there's nothing. You don't want to feel like someone could surprise you and come upon you and scare you. So it's about feeling safe but also secure, shedding the outside world, and then walking your way, meandering through these ginkgo trees, this forest of ginkgos, and then you're sort of pushed against this beautiful rammed earth wall that, again, it's a very tactile sense, and you're walking towards the front door. Then you get inside, and you see the painting to the left, and then you get your view of the reflecting pool. And this is a very tight budget. Everybody lost money on the design, and including the contractor, but it was just one of those projects that everybody believed in. So we went to what they call the boneyard, and we found old stone pieces left over from construction projects, and we use those as sculptural pieces in the landscape. So you can see if someone's walking by, you would see them. And then there are different places, different people can be using this at once. So somebody could be sitting here or here, and someone could be here sort of meditating, but they're not in each other's spaces or right next to each other. They have their own kind of personal space. And then looking back in the building, and what it looked like at night is very important as much as the daytime, because when it's closed after hours, they wanted the students to feel like they could be part of this space and not excluded from it, even when it's closed. This is another thing that was interesting to me at marking the passage of time. 2 things. One is this idea like the shadow moves across this wall, across the day, which really enlivens that wall, and it makes what would be kind of a static experience a very active or mutable kind of experience. And the other thing, it's not shown here, is the water, the light hits the water and it bounces up to here. So at certain times of the day, you just see the movement of water in there, and it's really relaxing and really beautiful, and again, a total accident. And so then this is the back side. There were louvers on the building, which are kind of at irregular intervals and irregular depth. And then there's this central courtyard, and it's right up against the forest. And so here we even left in some of the trees and opened up the roof so that, again, that landscape to architecture border was blurred. And then you can kind of walk through the woods and kind of sit up here and be here and like look back into these other galleries in the evening when it's closed. And when you're there, you also get this sort of louver kind of blocks part of the view and gives you a little sense of privacy. And then this is looking from the inside to the outside. So you're actually, it's kind of an inside-outside space, influenced by Japanese gardens. And again, this fountain, we found a piece at the Boneyard that we brought in to have a little bit of sound of water. And then this shows someone meditating and then walking the labyrinth. This is the same labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral, and this was something that we looked at a bunch of different primitive labyrinths and all these things. I was really excited to do something kind of unusual, but the Dean of Religious Life really wanted this, so that's what we ended up using. And then the students kind of take it on their own, and they go out there and they pile stones, and then there's just enough water to give us a little sound. This house is a house we did in Birmingham, Michigan, and most of our work's in California, although we have some projects throughout the country. This woman had a women's clothing store in New York and in Birmingham, and brought designers like Jill Sander to this country for the first time. She's in her probably early 80s. So this idea to create this house in this kind of very typical suburban setting in Michigan was important. So as you drive up the driveway, you kind of see over to the right. There's a pedestrian walk up to the front door. So the front door is right in this slot, not the most easy to find. So you walk here, and then again, we sort of like these layers that form space: the corten, the hedge, and then behind that, the grasses. And then as you go up those stairs, you see one of her sculptures that kind of draws you back towards that and kind of beckons you. And then you walk closer, and then you look back. And again, this is a little blue stem. The idea that, we tried to use as many natives as we could here, the river birch and the little blue stem. Again, it's the idea of a mass, but it's a fuzzy mass. And then as you walk into the entry foyer, or forecourt, you look back, and then the sun is rising and coming up over the mist, and you see the layers with the grasses. And then, the trees kind of like providing a foreground for this very stark building. People thought it looked like a dentist's office. I don't know any dentist's office that looks like that. And then this idea of, like a kind of floating benches of stone, and then the view through. We actually made sculpture because Linda thought it was more fun to make things than buy things. Her husband owns a quarry, so we kind of made this from the quarry. And this is kind of inspired by, a little bit, I guess, by MoMA in New York. But this is a family's main entrance. They walk from the garage to the right up to the front door. When here is the garage. And so they walk here, and they walk in, and then that's that little courtyard. So what happens is this is the dining room. So when you're in this dining room, you're actually looking straight out where the cars are parked. So kind of not great. So we work a lot in SketchUp, these like kind of as crude models, and we showed her that we needed to put a hedge there because she's going to be looking at her car, from her dining room table. So she's like, absolutely not. I'm not putting a hedge in there. And so we modeled it. We tried to convince her. And, it's a great thing about clients. They push you, and really good clients trust you, but they also push you. And so I finally said, well, Linda, what are we going to do? We have to screen that. You can't be looking at your car. And all along the process, even though this is very pristine and very beautiful, she kept showing us images of Anselm Kiefer and this sort of idea, this post-apocalyptic landscape. And you think you're outside of Detroit. There are all these kind of like the kind of the leftover pieces of old warehouses, a kind of a rotting culture. So this idea, like, this was very powerful for her. And so after looking at that for a while, then she told us about an experience she had where she went to Brazil, and this is Chris Burden piece called Beam Drop. And so it's a 5-foot deep pool of concrete. And over the course of a day, they take this crane, and you can go online and find this. It's fascinating. And watch them drop these I-beams into the concrete where they just get like stuck into the ground like pickup sticks. And so over the course of, and as it gets dark, you even see the sparks hitting them. So we said, well, Linda, why don't we do that? I can't even remember now whose idea it was because we were so joined at the hip at that point. So it was like, well, let's use that to be the living, the not living screen. And so instead of using a hedge, we grew vines on the garage, and we then created the scrim instead of the solid wall, which became this art piece from old torn down buildings in Detroit. And this is the front entrance. So the contractor, and it was a design build architect, a guy named Steve Sivak, and Steve went to looked at Tadao Ando's buildings to look at the concrete. Like, the concrete's really beautiful, but again, there's that tension between the roughness of the corten and these old I-beams with the beauty of that sculpture. We rarely do competitions. We're just not set up for it. But we won a competition maybe, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago. I forget now. It's been a while. To do a square in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The competition was sponsored by the Children's Museum, and we had a whole different design that we won with, but they couldn't build it, and no one liked it in the community, even though the jury liked it. So we had to redesign it. So the idea was, it was the kind of teach by example and make everything of that place, and that so all the plants are native plants to the Pittsburgh area. This was the square in the center, and it was Pittsburgh north. This was called Allegheny City. Now it's in the northern part of Pittsburgh, across from downtown. And so this was developed right after the Revolutionary War, and it was laid out with a very interesting plan where this was the central, like, pasture grazing land, and there were 4 quadrants, and the whole quadrants were laid out by the surveyor, and it was brilliant. And all the marketplace, this was the hub of the community. Of course, in the 60s with urban renewal, the whole thing got demoed and these really ugly buildings went around it. But the old observatory and the Children's Museum is in the 2 buildings to the north with the domes. So it was just like everything you don't want to do. Homeless people living there because they could hide under these overhangs. It was blazing hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. The whole thing needed to be redone. And in the left corner in the back is one of the first Carnegie libraries. And so one of the great things about Pittsburgh is foundations, and a lot of this was paid for by foundations. So this was the park after it was completed, and you can see that there's an art piece there, and it's very interesting working with artists. So this is Ned Kahn, and I took the idea to do the competition because I wanted to work with Ned, because I love Ned, and his work is about making the ephemera of nature visible with, like, fog and fire and water, and all those things are part of what he likes to do. And so he calls this Cloud Arbor, and we worked together to make the piece, so the piece was actually integrated into the landscape. And so you can see the square to the left where the sculpture is, and the rest. When we started presenting this to the city, they wanted this with the circle in the middle with the fountain, like it was in the Victorian times. And so we said, no, I can't do that. And so we got to do something modern, and we need more green. We need to have a bioswale. We need to cleanse the water. We need shade. We need, this needs to be, reflective of our times. But they also need some paved area for concerts and events. And so it had to be a really flexible kind of space. And so this was the plan that we ended up with. This is looking down from the building next door, and the Children's Museum moves these tables and chairs out there. And the stone is from the local Pennsylvania bluestone, And then what happens is the ball of the every few minutes this sphere, this orb of this cloud forms at the top, and then it falls across the landscape. And what's really lovely about it is this landscape, it's always changing, and it's great for the kids. The kids just love it because they're just like, this is an event for the Children's Museum, and they're like screaming and making up games and running through it. And it's really, really activated that space. And what's lovely, too, is the people who round it are kind of, are like eyes on the street, have taken to managing this and kind of keeping the riffraff out and keeping no kids are doing bad things. And this is a bioswale which has, these native flowers in it. And what's really interesting, these two women are sitting here having a conversation, and probably their kids are playing in a sculpture, but it erases the landscape around you, and suddenly you could be anywhere. You could be in some lovely field somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania. So it's really lovely is that the boundary of the space is erased by the art and brings your imagination as to what that is. And then here's another time of year with a bioswale, and Joe Pyeweed. And then even at night, now it feels safe to walk through there. I'm just going to show one little video here. We just finished a project. We designed, I think that someone mentioned it earlier, we designed 2 playgrounds in San Francisco at the Civic Center. The Civic Center has needed help for a long time. It's over a parking garage, and it's a very kind of Beaux-Arts kind of plan. And on 2 of the corners across from the Asian Art Museum and the San Francisco Public Library were 2 kind of very tired playgrounds in the 1980s. And so the Helen Diller Family Foundation donated $10 million to the city for design and construction of these playgrounds. And so they're going to open next week. So I'm just going to show you a little video because what we've done, we worked with a light artist, and the playgrounds are fairly far apart, but we wanted to connect them. And the way we could connect them through that space was with light at night, and also bring activation. So as you walk by the pieces, they will interact with you as you move by them, as you walk by them. So I'm just going to show this. It's a quick little video, and then so that's City Hall in the background. So the North Playground's on the right, and then these we call the pixel poles. This is a marble wall. So this is that light that's connecting you across. This was a couple weeks ago at bringing the donor there for the first time and kind of working on the lights. So the lights, and it's a civic plaza, so we wanted it to feel not too playful, but playful enough for the kids. But then you can see the lights, and then you can see they change. You can, and they'll be interacting with you as you walk by. And then in between, there's these projectors up on the Asian Art Museum and on the library. As you walk, it actually follows you and so people can dance, and it encourages interaction. So we're still working on the shapes a little bit, but you can see these people are kind of just having a great time. That's it. Thank you very much.